Queen Mary. The name is synonymous with royal stoicism. She was the grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II, a steel icon of duty, dignity, and almost emotionless composure. But this iconic image was not an innate trait. It was a psychological fortress built to defend against the memory of a catastrophe, a hidden tragedy the crown tried to bury. The tragedy of her own mother, Princess Mary Adelaide. This is the story of a living scandal. A princess, granddaughter of King George III, who lived a life of relentless public ridicule. She was a woman prejudged by society for her appearance, deemed unmarriageable and trapped in a humiliating spiral of debt. A spiral that ended in the ultimate indignity, being forced to flee England as a criminal. She was the mother the crown wished to forget, an unsuitable, Hanoverian mess in a new age of propriety. Yet, in a fateful twist of history, this outcast, bankrupt, and tragic woman, a woman dismissed as a failure, held the key to the very survival of the entire modern Windsor dynasty. The story of Mary Adelaide's financial and emotional chaos truly begins in the moral and financial swamp she was born into, the House of Hanover. Her grandfather was King George III, a man modern historians like Andrew Roberts have described not only as the king who lost the American colonies and descended into madness, but also as the head of a completely dysfunctional family. But as biographers like Christopher Hibbert have argued, the king's mental instability was arguably less damaging to the crown's reputation than the conscious behavior of his sons. He and his wife, Queen Charlotte, had 15 children. Their sons, contemptuously known to Queen Victoria's generation as the wicked uncles, were a public relations disaster. They were spendthrifts, gamblers, gluttons, and legendary philanderers who pushed public and parliamentary patience to its limit. Most prominent was George the Prince, Regent. He was a man of exquisite taste, gifting Britain works like the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, but also a man of grotesque self-indulgence. Contemporary diarists described him as so obese he was compared to a whale. His catastrophic marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was a national farce. He loathed her so much that, as parliamentary records show, he tried to pass a bill to strip her of the title of queen and bar her from his own coronation, an effort that failed and made him incredibly unpopular. Next was Prince Frederick, Duke of York. He was commander-in-chief of the army, but his legacy was permanently stained by his mistress, Mary Ann Clarke. In 1809, a scandal erupted across the front pages of the Times and the Morning Chronicle, alleging that Clarke had used her influence to sell army commissions, literally selling military ranks from their bedroom. The scandal rocked the government and forced the Duke to resign in disgrace. Then there was Prince William, Duke of Clarence, who lived for 20 years in domestic bliss with his mistress, the famous actress Dorothea Jordan. They had 10 illegitimate children, the Fitz-Clarences. But when political pressure mounted, he cast her aside to find a royal bride who could produce a legitimate heir, leaving her to die in poverty and exile in Paris. Among the more amiable sons was Mary Adelaide's father, Prince Adulus, Duke of Cambridge, who was serving as viceroy in Hanover. For decades, this generation of royal dukes lived their scandalous, debt-ridden lives, producing dozens of illegitimate children, but not a single one among them had a legitimate royal heir. The entire future of the United Kingdom rested on one person, Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only child of the disastrous Prince Regent. She was the nation's hope, beloved by the public. And then, in November 1817, the unthinkable happened. Charlotte, aged 21, died after a 50-hour labor along with her newborn son. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe a nation paralyzed. The kingdom was plunged into mourning. Black cloth sold out in London. But for the wicked uncles, her tragic death was a starting pistol. The succession was in crisis. There was no heir. What followed was one of the most undignified and politically crucial events in British history, the royal baby race. In a complete panic, the middle-aged bachelor dukes, all in their 40s and 50s, hastily dumped their long-term mistresses and frantically scoured the small duchies of Germany for suitable Protestant wives. It was not a search for love, but a dynastic breeding transaction. It was a race to the altar, and then to the nursery to produce the next king or queen of England. 1818 was a flurry of hasty weddings. The Duke of Clarence married Adelaide of Saxon-Meiningen. The Duke of Kent, a harsh military man of 50, married a widowed German princess, Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. And Mary Adelaide's father, Adelais, also married a German princess, the beautiful Augusta of Hesse-Kassel. The race was on. In 1819, 2 babies were born who would change history. First, in Hanover, the Duke of Cambridge had a son, Prince George. For a moment, it looked like he was the future. But just 3 days later, at Kensington Palace in London, the Duke of Kent's wife gave birth to a daughter. They named her Alexandrina Victoria. Because her father Edward was senior to Adelais, this baby girl Victoria jumped ahead of her cousin George in the line of succession. She was the heir. Into this new, suddenly fertile generation, a third royal baby was born in Hanover, where her father was serving as viceroy. On November 27, 1833, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge arrived. She was a granddaughter of King George III, a princess of the blood, and most importantly, a first cousin to the young woman who was now indisputably the future queen. Mary Adelaide's childhood, as her biographers note, was the complete antithesis of her cousin Victoria's. While Victoria was being imprisoned in the gloomy, isolated, and emotionally abusive Kensington system by her paranoid mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her ambitious advisor John Conroy, Mary Adelaide was growing up in a boisterous, loving, and wildly indulgent home in Hanover. Victoria, as she wrote in her diaries, endured a rather melancholy childhood. She was forbidden from crying in public, forbidden from playing with other children, and, in a famous detail, forbidden from walking down the stairs without an adult holding her hand. She was a political pawn in a battle for power. Mary Adelaide, by contrast, was raised in warmth and chaos. Her parents, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, were famously, almost shockingly devoted to each other and their 3 children, George, Augusta, and the baby Mary Adelaide. In an age of aristocratic restraint, their demonstrative family warmth drew teasing nicknames from their colder English relatives. This upbringing is the key to all her later tragedies and triumphs. Mary Adelaide was not raised with the cold, rigid sense of self-denial that was beaten into Victoria. She was raised with love, laughter, and unrestricted indulgence. She was praised, she was adored, and she was encouraged to be herself. Her personality, her openness, her intense compassion, and her impulsiveness, which would later be her greatest social flaw, was forged in this happy home. She learned to be joyful, she learned to be generous, and she learned to eat. Her father was a typical Hanoverian, famous for his great appetite and booming voice. Mary Adelaide in every way was her father's daughter, a woman of intense feeling and vibrant energy. This happy bubble burst in 1837. Her uncle, King William IV, died. Her 18-year-old cousin Victoria ascended the throne of the United Kingdom. But there was a serious legal problem. The Kingdom of Hanover, which had been linked to the British crown since George I operated under Salic law, an ancient German code forbidding a woman from ruling. The crowns of the United Kingdom and Hanover were split for the first time in over a century. Victoria became Queen of England. The crown of Hanover passed to her eldest surviving and least loved uncle, an arch-conservative, the Duke of Cumberland. Mary Adelaide's father, Adelaide's job as Viceroy in Hanover, was gone. And so the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge packed up their family, including the 4-year-old Mary Adelaide, and returned to London. They settled in apartments at Kensington Palace, just across the courtyard from the Duchess of Kent, mother of the new queen. Mary Adelaide's idyllic German childhood was over, and her life as a royal problem was about to begin. The London the Cambridge family returned to was a world being actively and ruthlessly purged of its Hanoverian legacy. The new young Queen Victoria, and especially her husband-to-be Prince Albert of Saxe, Coburg and Gotha, were on a moral crusade. They were determined to transform the British monarchy from a scandalous, debt-ridden joke into a symbol of morality, propriety, and bourgeois responsibility. The new words of the day were duty, morality, and restraint. The Cambridge family, with their hot and taut manners, their booming laughs, and their casual, warm emotionalism, were already suspect. They were a living reminder of the wicked uncle generation Victoria was trying to erase, but they were family, and they were absorbed into the fabric of the court. Mary Adelaide and her older sister Augusta were raised as English princesses. As they grew into teenagers, their paths and their value on the dynastic marriage market began to diverge dramatically. Princess Augusta, born in 1822, was the perfect Victorian princess. She was slender, elegant, quiet, and deeply pious. She was the model of demure femininity that Victoria and Albert were trying to promote. As a result, she was a resounding success. In 1843, she made a perfectly suitable, if unexciting, match with her first cousin Frederick William, the future Grand Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She did her duty, married well, and moved to Germany. One princess sold, and then there was Mary Adelaide. As Mary Adelaide entered her teens, it became clear she was different. She was the absolute antithesis of the Victorian ideal. Where her sister was shy, Mary Adelaide was boisterous. Where her sister was demure, Mary Adelaide was passionate. Diarists like Charles Greville described her as having a booming, infectious laugh that would echo through the staid halls of St. James's Palace. She was clever, witty, and had a sparkling, magnetic charisma. People loved to be around her. She was, in short, the life of every party, and she was, in the words of countless contemporaries, becoming enormous. This, in the 19th century marriage market, was a fatal flaw. This was an era where frailty was fashionable. Tuberculosis or consumption was morbidly romanticized in literature and art. A delicate, consumptive, pale look was seen as the peak of feminine beauty, a sign of spiritual refinement. A woman was supposed to be a fragile, ethereal creature. Mary Adelaide was not. She was a full-bodied, energetic Hanoverian. She had her family's famous Hanoverian skin, a beautiful, clear complexion and bright, sparkling eyes. But she also had the Hanoverian appetite. She adored food. She adored dancing. She adored living. And in the repressed, tightly controlled atmosphere of Victoria's court, her vibrant vitality was seen as vulgar. Her two problems were now firmly established. The first was her appearance, which was brutally commented on in the diaries and letters of every courtier. The second and far more serious problem was her bank account. In 1850, her beloved father, the Duke of Cambridge, died. Mary Adelaide was 16. Her family's primary source of income died with him, while her brother George inherited the dukedom. Mary Adelaide, her mother, and her sister were suddenly much poorer. Parliament, in a not very impressive fit of generosity, granted Mary Adelaide a personal annuity of £3,000 per year. It sounds like a fortune, but for Her Royal Highness in the 19th century, it was a trap. It was a cruel joke. A princess of her rank, a king's granddaughter, was required to maintain a household. She had to have ladies-in-waiting, footmen, and her own carriages. She was required to have a wardrobe of couture gowns from the great houses of London and Paris for every ball, every state dinner, every reception. And most importantly, she was required to donate vast sums of money to charities to prove her royal beneficence. This was a non-negotiable public duty. Her £3,000 annuity might have covered her dressmaker's bill. Maybe the system had given her the title, the status, and all the crushing expectations of a top-tier royal, but it denied her the money to support it. She was expected to live like a millionaire on an upper-middle-class budget. She had the bloodline of a queen, but the dowry of a minor country gentlewoman. From the very beginning, she was set up to fail, and so, the most humiliating decade of her life began. Her 20s, the 1850s. She was now officially on the market, and season after season she was paraded at every ball, every society event. And season after season, she was publicly and painfully rejected. The search for a husband became the royal family's most embarrassing parlor game. Queen Victoria, Europe's ultimate matchmaker, was obsessed with the Mary problem. She and her ministers drew up lists. The first candidate was the newly crowned and widowed Emperor Napoleon III of France. He was looking for a royal bride to legitimize his new regime. Mary Adelaide, a British princess, was offered. According to rumors that swept the courts of Europe, he took one look at her and politely declined, choosing instead the beautiful and slender Eugène de Monto. Next was the widowed King Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia. He was a gruff, powerful man, and needed an alliance with Britain. Surely he would see her value. The match was proposed. He reportedly saw her and declared her tropposa, too large. Even the Crown Prince of Sweden was considered. He was suitable. He was Protestant. He was looking for a wife. But he too passed, choosing Princess Louise of the Netherlands. One by one, from great kings to minor Dutch princes, they were trotted out, and one by one they all declined. Imagine the crushing, repetitive public humiliation. Each failure was not a private rejection. It was a matter of state, a subject of diplomatic cables, and worst of all, a topic of delicious, vicious gossip in every drawing room in London. The satirical magazine Punch, which had become the sharp-toothed chronicler of the era, began to take notice. They didn't have to be explicit. They just drew cruel caricatures. Her enormous frame draped in royal finery, her eyes wide, desperately searching a ballroom for a partner. The Whispers became a nickname, one that would follow her for the rest of her life. In some Victorian press accounts and private letters, she was dubbed Fat Mary, a cruel slur today, and a social death sentence at the time. It was a label of devastating cruelty, a way to reduce this intelligent, warm, and vibrant woman to a single physical attribute. By 1863, she was 30 years old. In the brutal calculus of the Victorian aristocracy, her life was over. She was an old maid. She was on the shelf. She was a royal embarrassment. The unmarriageable princess living in her aging mother's apartments at Kensington Palace, a permanent, smiling, and too grand fixture at court. She was, by her own account, deeply unhappy. She wrote to her brother lamenting her melancholy and her solitary life. She had all the burdens of royalty,
The endless, mind-numbing public appearances, the constant scrutiny, the suffocating rules, and absolutely none of the rewards. She had no home of her own, no husband, no children, no purpose. She was trapped in a gilded, velvet-lined cage, and the press, the court, and even her own family were rattling the bars, laughing at her. Her story seemed to be over, a footnote of failure. But Mary Adelaide, in her desperation, was about to find the one man in Europe as unmarriageable as she was. But for Queen Victoria, the Mary problem was not just a personal tragedy for her cousin. It was an administrative mess and a public relations failure. The Queen herself, the very model of domestic fecundity, was surrounded by her own 9 children. She was a tireless, obsessive matchmaker, and her 30-year-old unmarried cousin living just across the courtyard was a glaring public failure of her system. The situation was simply not respectable. It was a messy, unresolved Hanoverian loose end, a reminder of the past the Queen was working so hard to bury. The search for a husband for Mary Adelaide now changed. It was no longer a search for a great match, but for any match. The criteria once so lofty, aiming for the kings of France and Sardinia, were now scraped from the bottom of the barrel. The requirements were reduced to the bare minimum. The man must be Protestant. He must be of royal blood, however diluted, and at this point, he must simply be willing. The candidate pool was bleak. The great royal houses of Europe had all passed on her. But there was another, murkier pool to draw from: the world of morganatic marriages. Morganatic was a polite 19th century term for a dynastic disaster. It was when a man of high royal rank, a duke, a prince, married a woman of a lower class, like a mere countess or baroness.
The marriage was considered legal in the church, but the wife, and more importantly any children, were barred from inheriting their father's titles, rank, or throne. They were royal adjacent, but not royal. They were the embarrassing second-tier relations, a prince with no kingdom, a princess with no precedence. They had the name, but none of the power, and usually very little of the money. It was in this pool of handsome, well-bred, but fundamentally damaged goods that Queen Victoria's matchmakers finally found a candidate. His name was Prince Francis of Teck. On paper, Francis was a fantasy. Born in 1837, he was 4 years younger than Mary Adelaide. He was tall, dark, and possessed a brooding, almost cinematic beauty. He had a magnificent military bearing and a perfectly waxed mustache. By all accounts, he was one of the most handsome men in Europe. But his pedigree, like Mary Adelaide's finances, was a house of cards. His father was Duke Alexander of Württemberg, a man in the direct line of a German throne. But his mother was the problem. She was Countess Claudine Rede Vonnes Rade, a beautiful but mere Hungarian noblewoman. Because of this morganatic union, Francis and his 2 sisters were shut out. Under the strict rules of the House of Württemberg, they were not styled Prince of Württemberg. They were not Serene Highnesses. Instead, they were granted a lesser, almost meaningless title invented for them: Prince of Teck, a title tied to a small, obscure castle in Württemberg. Francis, in effect, had no kingdom, no inheritance, no real job, and most critically, no money. He had a small allowance from his father and his dashing good looks, but nothing else. He, in his own way, was just as unmarriageable as Mary Adelaide. He was the perfect male counterpart to her own predicament. All style, no substance. And by all accounts, he was a difficult man. Biographers describe him as deeply, painfully insecure about his inferior morganatic status. He was proud. He was moody, and he was consumed with a sense of grievance that the world had not given him what he was owed. He loathed being seen as a second-ass prince. In 1865, the match was proposed. It was in essence a cold, hard, aristocratic deal, a merger of two damaged portfolios. Here was the bargain. Francis, the handsome, penniless, low-rank prince, would get her. He would marry Her Royal Highness of Great Britain and Ireland, a granddaughter of a king, a first cousin to the Queen. By marrying her, he would instantly be elevated. His status would be laundered. He would gain access to the very top tier of European royalty. And Mary Adelaide, the 32-year-old spinster, ridiculed for her appearance and her poverty, would get him. She would get a husband, and a shockingly handsome one at that. She would get a wedding ring. She would get her own household. She would at long last escape her mother's apartment and the crushing humiliation of the marriage market. She would get a life. They met in 1865. For Mary Adelaide, who had been starved of romantic attention her entire life, it was electric. She didn't see the deal. She saw the fairy tale. She saw a handsome prince on a white horse rescuing her from her tower. She fell head over heels with the desperate, uncritical passion of a woman who had been waiting 30 years to be chosen. She was, in her own words, giddy with happiness. For Francis, it was a transaction. He was polite, he was charming, but his letters reveal a man focused on the practicalities, on his future status, on his financial settlement, on what he was getting. The engagement was announced. The court sighed in collective relief. The Mary problem was solved. They were married on June 12, 1866, at St. Anne's Church in Kew. It was not a grand Westminster Abbey state affair. It was a relatively quiet local ceremony. But for Mary Adelaide, it was the greatest triumph of her life. She was finally Her Royal Highness, Princess of Teck. She had a husband. She was free. Queen Victoria, relieved to have her cousin settled, was cautiously generous. She gave the new couple apartments at Kensington Palace for their London residence, and more importantly, a Grace and Favour country home, White Lodge, a stunning former royal hunting lodge in the middle of Richmond Park. And for a brief, shining moment, it was idyllic. Mary Adelaide, now 33, threw herself into the role she had always craved, that of wife, mother, and shadelin. She adored White Lodge. She adored decorating. She adored, more than anything, being the mistress of her own home. She was, by all accounts, deliriously happy. And in 1867, her ultimate vindication arrived. She gave birth to a daughter, Victoria Mary, Augusta Louise Olga Pauline Claudine, Agnes. They called her May. This baby, from the moment of her birth, was special, not just to her mother, but to the Queen. She was a new, healthy, English-born princess in the royal line. Queen Victoria stood as her godmother. This was the little girl born in the happy glow of her mother's new life, who would grow up to be the formidable Queen Mary. 3 sons followed in quick succession: Adelaide in 1868, Francis in 1870, and Alexander in 1874. Mary Adelaide had done it. She had defied all the critics. She had beaten the system. She was 40 years old, no longer Fat Mary, but a respected matron, a royal highness, the mother of 4 beautiful, healthy children, with a handsome prince at her side. On the surface, she had achieved the perfect Victorian dream. But the single fundamental problem that had plagued her entire life, the one that had made her unmarriageable in the first place, had not been solved. It had been doubled. Now there wasn't just one royal with spectacularly expensive tastes and a tiny, inadequate income. There were 2. The problem was this: Mary Adelaide's 3,000 parliamentary annuity was combined with her mother's,
When her mother, the old Duchess of Cambridge, died in 1889, Mary Adelaide's personal income would rise to £5,000. But until then, she and Francis were living on a combined income of about £4,000 a year, supplemented by a small allowance from Francis's father. On this, they were expected to run two households, the grand apartments at Kensington Palace and the sprawling White Lodge. They had to employ a full staff of secretaries, ladies-in-waiting, tutors, nannies, footmen, cooks, and gardeners. They had to dress themselves and 4 children in clothes befitting their rank. They had to entertain, and they had to be charitable. A sensible, frugal couple might have managed. They might have lived quietly, retired to White Lodge and managed their accounts. But Mary Adelaide and Francis were not a sensible, frugal couple. They were two of the most insecure and therefore most extravagant people in Europe. First, there was Francis. He was miserable. His new life had not delivered the status he craved. 11 days after the wedding, Queen Victoria had granted him the style His Royal Highness in England. But it was a courtesy, not a right. In the strict courts of Germany, he was still the inferior morganatic prince.
He was a man with no portfolio, no official duties, and no real purpose other than being Princess Mary's husband. He became, by all accounts, a profoundly difficult man. He was moody, depressive, and prone to fits of dark, brooding temper. He would disappear to his London clubs for days, and he spent money as a way to assert his status. He spent on immaculate military uniforms, on his horses, on his membership fees to the most exclusive clubs, all the accoutrements of a high-status male to prove that he belonged. And then there was Mary Adelaide. She was a Hanoverian to her core. She had spent 32 years in frugal spinsterhood, pinching pennies in her mother's apartment, watching others live. Now it was her turn. She was a royal highness, and she was by God going to live like one. She began to spend with a joyous, terrifying, almost pathological abandon. She threw off the caution her former poverty had forced on her. She threw the most lavish, most talked-about parties in London. She ordered gowns not by the dozen but by the score from the most expensive Paris designers, like Charles Frederick Worth, often wearing them only once. She was covered in jewels, many of them borrowed on credit from jewelers like Gerard, who were at first thrilled to have a royal highness as a client. And most disastrously of all, she was generous. Her generosity was not a calculated PR move. It was a genuine, deeply ingrained, and financially suicidal character trait. She had an almost physical inability to say no. She couldn't say no to a friend in need. She couldn't say no to a new charity. She couldn't say no to an old soldier who wrote her a begging letter. She gave away money she did not have daily. She ran up astronomical bills at local shops near Richmond and Kensington. The butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, the wine merchants, they all had massive unpaid ledgers for the Tentec household. In essence, she was behaving like her cousin, the Prince of Wales, who had a colossal income from the Duke of Cornwall. The Tentecs were living like the main line of the royal family, but on the allowance of a distant, poor relation. In 1874, an observer at a lavish ball noted, "The Princess of Tentec, poor thing, is as fat as ever. She wore a mountain of diamonds. Where she gets them all, I can't imagine." The answer was simple: credit. By the early 1880s, the situation had deteriorated from a private difficulty into a full-blown public scandal. The bills were no longer manageable. They were mountainous.
We're talking about tens of thousands of pounds, the equivalent of millions today. The polite letters from shopkeepers had turned into angry demands. Then the inevitable happened. The creditors, having been ignored for years, gave up. They took the unthinkable step, a step that shocked Victorian society. They began to sue a member of the royal family. This was a catastrophe. It was the talk of London. The press, which had always mocked her size, now had real blood in the water. Fat Mary wasn't just a figure of fun. She was a royal parasite, a spendthrift, a disgrace to the crown. The Punch cartoons became even more vicious, depicting her as a colossal figure, literally eating the nation's money. Queen Victoria was incandescent with rage. This was her worst nightmare realized. It was the wicked uncle behavior, the debauched Hanoverian excess she had worked her entire life to extinguish, bubbling up again in her own cousin. It brought the entire monarchy, her new, respectable monarchy, into disrepute. Mary Adelaide, in a panic, wrote a graveling, desperate 16-page letter to the Queen. She begged for help. She blamed her husband. She blamed the system. She promised to be better. Victoria was not moved. She wrote back, her pen dripping with icy fury. "My dear Mary," she began, "your letter has given me great pain. You must be aware that I have not the means of paying other people's debts. It is a disgrace. Your rank only makes the contrast greater. A poor gentleman or lady would have starved rather than go on." The Queen's message was clear. You made this mess. You will lie in it. I will not bail you out. Parliament, which had to approve all royal funds, was even less sympathetic. They were already sick of funding the Queen's 9 children and sprawling network of German relations.
The idea of giving more money to the feckless spendthrift texts was met with derisive laughter. By 1883, Mary Adelaide and Francis were trapped. They had no money, they had no credit. They were social paras, and they were, in a very real sense, prisoners in their own home, as they could not appear in public without being served a writ by a furious creditor. Only one option was left, the option of last resort for the disgraced aristocracy, the path of ultimate shame, exile. This financial collapse was not just a private matter, it was a public scandal. As creditors began to sue, and Queen Victoria refused a bailout, only one option remained. It was the most crushing public and total humiliation imaginable. Her Royal Highness, Princess Mary Adelaide Maua, was forced to flee her own country as a common criminal. By 1883, there was no other choice. The tax debts, estimated to be the equivalent of millions today, had become an unmanageable public scandal. Creditors from high-end Paris couturiers to local Richmond butchers had lost patience. Lawsuits were filed. Punch and other satirical magazines had turned Princess Mary Adelaide into a national symbol of profligacy. And Queen Victoria, in a cold fury at this humiliation to the crown's reputation, definitively refused. There would be no bailout from Parliament. There would be no intervention from the Queen's private purse. The Queen's message was clear. Mary, Adelaide, and Francis had made this mess. They would have to get out of it themselves. Only one option was left. The option of last resort for the disgraced aristocracy. The path of ultimate shame. Exile. It was the most crushing public and total humiliation imaginable. Her Royal Highness, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, granddaughter of King George III, first cousin of Queen Victoria,
was forced to flee her own country like a common criminal, a debtor. In June 1883, the Tex held a grand farewell reception, an elaborate charade to pretend to the world that this was all a planned, civilized retirement. No one in London society was fooled. Contemporary diarists described the event with brutal sarcasm. Everyone knew the truth. A few days later, Princess Mary Adelaide, Prince Francis, and their 4 teenage children, including the 16-year-old Princess May, slipped out of London. They told the press they were retiring to Germany and Italy for a period of economy and retrenchment. Their retirement was not a grand tour. It was a humiliating nomadic existence. They lived as royal gypsies for the next 2 years. And this was the absolute nadir of Mary Adelaide's life. They drifted between cheap hotels in Florence, Italy, where they could live anonymously at low cost, and the spare, often drafty rooms of their more responsible and deeply judgmental German relatives. They spent time with Mary Adelaide's sister Augusta, the Grand Duchess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Augusta, whom we remember as the perfect Victorian princess, slender, pious, and frugal, was reportedly horrified by her sister's complete lack of self-control. To Augusta, Mary Adelaide's bankruptcy was not a misfortune. It was a moral failure, proof of the character weakness that had been evident since their childhood. For Mary Adelaide, this was a living death. She was a woman who lived for society, for parties, for her charity committees, for the roar of the London crowds. Her entire sense of self was built on her public presence. And now, at 50, she was hiding in second-rate Italian pensions, a pariah, a forgotten joke. She had spent her life fighting to be seen as more than her body, more than her bank account. And now she was reduced to being nothing but her debts. The girl who was too grand had been brought lower than she could ever have imagined, and she had dragged her 4 innocent children down with her. This exile was the direct result of the debts. But to truly understand why those debts existed, we must step back and look at the deeper psychological war Mary Adelaide faced all her life. It was a war not just about money, but about public perception. A war that defined her and, more importantly, created the daughter who would save the monarchy. It is one thing to read about debts and exile in a history book. It is quite another to understand the daily personal and psychological reality of that life.
The nickname Fat Mary whispered in drawing rooms and hinted at in the press was not a harmless joke. In the 21st century, we have a language for this body shaming. In the 19th century, there was no such concept. It was simply a fact stated with the casual, brutal cruelty of the era. This label, which followed her from her teens to her grave, was a weapon. It was a tool used by the press and by high society to diminish her, to define her, to reduce her formidable intelligence, her genuine wit, and her radical kindness to a single physical attribute. It was the ultimate ad hominem attack, and it was relentless. The Victorian ideal of beauty was not just an aesthetic. It was a moral statement. The perfect woman was fragile, demure, and pale. Her delicacy was seen as a sign of her innate spiritual refinement. A robust appetite, a large frame, a booming laugh. These were seen as vulgar, signs of a coarse and undisciplined nature, traits of the lower classes. Mary Adelaide's body was, in the eyes of the establishment, a physical manifestation of her lack of self-control. If she could not control her body, how could she control her finances? But Mary Adelaide's tragedy and her ultimate defiant triumph was that she refused to act ashamed. She loved food. She was a true gourmet in the great Hanoverian tradition of her father and uncles. She enjoyed her meals, and she enjoyed them publicly. She did not nibble at a dry biscuit or a lettuce leaf as other society women did in public. She ate. She laughed loudly. She took up space. This in itself was a small daily act of radical defiance. She refused to apologize for her appetite, for her body, for her very existence. This defiance made her a pariah in the cold, judgmental drawing rooms of Buckingham Palace, but it made her a superstar outside of them. Mary Adelaide, trapped by her unmarriageable status and her lack of a real role, decided to invent one. In the 1870s, before her financial crash, she pioneered a new kind of royalty. While the rest of the royal family, especially Queen Victoria, were hidden away, Victoria herself was in deep perpetual mourning, a remote widow in black. Mary Adelaide was out. She became the patron of hundreds of charities, and she was not, like so many royals before and since, just a name on the letterhead. She showed up. She plunged into the most notorious slums of London's East End, places other royals wouldn't dream of visiting. She visited workhouses. She sat on the boards of hospitals, opened orphanages, and funded soup kitchens. And when she arrived, she didn't just cut a ribbon with a gloved hand. She talked to people. She remembered their names. She would sit with the poor, laugh with them, cry with them. She was warm, tactile, and intensely, wonderfully emotional. She would famously visit the overcrowded wards of children's hospitals, and instead of just observing, she would sit on the beds, hold the children, and tell them stories, often weeping openly with the nurses. The public had never seen a royal behave this way. They were used to royalty as a remote, symbolic spectacle. Mary Adelaide was a human being. They fell in love with her. She was their princess. They would line the streets not just for a royal procession, but for her, cheering her carriage as she went about her charitable rounds. They loved her precisely because she was too grand, because she was colorful and joyous and real in a gray, industrial, and deeply unequal world. She was, in every meaningful way, the first people's princess, a full century before Diana. But this very public warmth, this extravagant outward-facing emotion, had a high price at home. It created a complete and devastating opposite reaction right in her own family. The most profound and lasting personal impact of Mary Adelaide's life was her relationship with her daughter May. Princess May, the future Queen Mary, grew up in a household of total emotional and financial chaos. She was not just a child. She was the silent, watchful, and deeply intelligent witness to her parents' spectacular self-destruction. Imagine it from May's perspective. You are a shy, serious girl, and your home is in constant upheaval. You are not just a princess. You are an unwilling accountant, a mediator. You see the unopened bills piling up on the hallway table. You hear the hushed, then angry arguments between your parents about money. You see your mother, whom you are told to respect as a royal highness, weeping with joy over a new Paris gown one minute, and weeping with despair over a creditor's letter the next. You see your father, the handsome prince, retreat into dark, simmering rages, his own status insecurities poisoning the atmosphere of the home. Then, at 16, your life is completely uprooted. You are forced into exile. You are dragged around Europe living out of suitcases and borrowed rooms, a recipient of other people's charity. The entire world knows why. They know your family is a disgrace. May's reaction to this childhood was not one of rebellion. It was one of profound, life-altering psychological self-preservation. She looked at her mother's life,
the emotionalism, the extravagance, the chaos, the mess, and she vowed with every fiber of her being to be the opposite. While Mary Adelaide was emotional, May became pathologically shy and reserved. While Mary Adelaide was extravagant, May became frugal to the point of austerity. While Mary Adelaide was loud, tactile, and messy, May became obsessed with order, duty, punctuality, and propriety. While Mary Adelaide was perpetually in debt, May would develop a lifelong obsession with collecting, cataloging jewels, furniture, and objects of art, a way of securing tangible, permanent, controllable assets. There is a famous and terribly sad anecdote from their time at White Lodge. Mary Adelaide, with her booming, irrepressible voice and infectious laugh, would often call for her daughter, her voice echoing through the halls. May, a courtier, noted that every time Princess May heard her mother's call, she would visibly flinch. She was deeply, painfully embarrassed by her mother. She was embarrassed by her mother's size, by her loudness, by her un-English emotionalism, and above all, by the public, humiliating poverty her mother's grandness had brought upon them.
May was the intensely sober child of an alcoholic, vowing never to touch a drop. Her mother's chaos was, to her, a source of constant, burning internal shame. Mary Adelaide, for her part, adored her daughter, but was completely baffled by her. She called May my best girl, and she truly was her mother's right hand, helping to manage the chaotic household accounts, writing letters, and trying to impose order. But Mary Adelaide couldn't understand her daughter's coldness, her impenetrable shyness, her total lack of spontaneity. In her letters, Mary Adelaide would lament May's dullness, her sad little face. She tried to dress her in bright colors, but May preferred somber, simple grays and beiges. Mary Adelaide had given her daughter life, but the chaos of that life had forged her into her mother's polar opposite, a living, breathing rejection of everything Mary Adelaide stood for. This psychological chasm is the most profound and lasting personal impact of Mary Adelaide's life. She had created the very person who would, in an act of profound self-defense, try to erase her. Queen Mary's entire public persona, the formidable rigidity, the unflinching, almost inhuman devotion to duty, the icy reserve, the famous unsmiling stare. It was all a fortress she had started building as a little girl in White Lodge to protect herself from the memory of her mother's glorious, beloved, and devastating chaos. That same shy, psychologically wounded girl, May, returned with her family from exile in 1885. They were punished. They were broken. And Queen Victoria only allowed them to return on one condition: that they would live quietly within their means and cause no further embarrassment to the crown. They were allowed to return to White Lodge, but Mary Adelaide could not be quiet. It was not in her nature. She was 52 years old, and she had survived the ultimate social death. She had been to hell and back, and she threw herself back into public life with a vengeance. She was astonishingly more popular than ever. The public had missed her. They had missed her joy, her warmth, her grandness. Her return was a triumph. The crowds cheered her just as loudly as they had before. She had lost the battle for wealth, but she was winning the war for public love. And now she had one final, impossible, audacious goal left. She was going to use that popularity and every last drop of her social cunning to secure her family's future. She was going to make her shy, dull, reserved daughter May the next Queen of England. It was an extraordinary, audacious plan, especially for a woman just returned from disgrace. But that very disgrace, her bankruptcy, is the most controversial point of her legacy. So, how should we judge her? Was she a foolish spendthrift or a victim? This extraordinary gamble to transform a socially overlooked daughter into the future queen was formed even as she returned from disgrace. It forces us to confront the central, controversial question of her legacy. How should we judge her? For over a century, the answer was simple. The judgmental narrative favored by Victorian biographers and repeated for decades is clear and damning. Princess Mary Adelaide was a foolish, vain, gluttonous, and deeply irresponsible woman. She was a royal parasite who lived extravagantly on the public purse, refused to control her appetites or her spending, and brought shame upon her family and the crown. She was a caricature, a fat Mary in both body and budget, a cautionary tale of Honorian excess. And let us be perfectly clear. The facts of her extravagance are undeniable. She was a financial disaster. There is no historical argument that absolves her of her personal choices. The archives, including the records of the Lord Chamberlain's office and her personal papers, confirm she owed staggering sums. She owed everyone from the most elite royal suppliers to her personal lady's maid. The debts were real. They were crushing, and they were in large part her own fault. Her desperate 16-page letter to Queen Victoria begging for a bailout is a masterclass in deflection, entitlement, and a complete lack of financial understanding. But to end the argument, there is lazy. It ignores the complex, contradictory, and deeply hypocritical system that set her up to fail from the moment she was born. Was she a spendthrift? Unquestionably. But was she also a victim of that very system? Absolutely. Consider the impossible trap she was in. Mary Adelaide was Her Royal Highness, a granddaughter of King George III. She was by blood in the absolute top tier of European royalty, far superior in rank to the minor German prinklings who flocked to the English court. Yet she was given a parliamentary annuity, initially £3,000, that made it functionally impossible to live the life her rank demanded. The Victorian establishment and Queen Victoria herself demanded that she look the part. She was a living, breathing symbol of British royal prestige. She was expected to wear the jewels, to host the parties, to ride in the grand carriages, and to patronize the arts. She was required to dress in the height of fashion, a walking advertisement for the couturier of London and Paris, and she was required to be the face of royal charity, which meant donating vast sums of money. It was an impossible, unwinnable game. When she failed to live up to this standard of glamour, she was mocked in private letters as Poor Mary, a disappointment. When she tried to live up to it by borrowing on credit, she was condemned publicly as a profligate spendthrift. She was trapped between the crushing public expectations of her rank and the brutal private reality of her bank account. Furthermore, we must ask, what was her alternative? In the 19th century, a woman of her class had precisely one job available to her: wife. A career was unthinkable, and the system, the great aristocratic marriage market, had for 30 years deemed her unfit for even that role, precisely because of her appearance and her poverty. She was denied the one career she was raised for, locked out by the very men who then criticized her for having no purpose. So what did she do? She created a new job for herself. As we've seen, she invented the role of the full-time professional charitable royal. She was arguably the hardest-working member of the royal family of her generation. With a grueling public schedule that would exhaust a modern politician, she poured her formidable, boundless energy, the energy she couldn't use on a husband or a kingdom of her own, into public service. She became the face of hundreds of charities, the most visible and beloved royal in the country, second only to the Prince of Wales. The controversy is that she believed this work entitled her to the lifestyle. She felt in her Hanoverian heart that she was earning her keep. She was performing the duties of a great princess. So why should she not live like one? When she paid for her charitable work by opening a bazaar or donating money she didn't have. Was it pure vanity? Or was it a desperate, misguided attempt to fulfill the public-facing role she believed was her sacred duty? The simple spendthrift narrative also conveniently ignores the other major player in the financial disaster, her husband, Prince Francis of Teck. Historically, he is often portrayed as the long-suffering, handsome partner dragged down by his wife's catastrophic debts.
This, too, is a simplistic and largely inaccurate reading. Francis was a deeply unhappy man consumed by his own status anxiety. As mentioned, he loathed his inferior morganatic rank. He desperately craved a Royal Highness title for himself in his own right, which Queen Victoria pointedly and repeatedly refused to grant him. He was a man with no job and a colossal ego, and he too was spending extravagantly. He spent on his immaculate uniforms, on his horses, on his membership fees to the most exclusive London clubs, and on his own pursuits. He was not trying to rein his wife in. He was competing with her, trying to buy the status that blood had denied him. As biographers have pointed out, he was at best a willing co-conspirator in their financial ruin, not its innocent victim. Their exile was as much his fault as hers. Their marriage was never a simple love story. It was a complex, difficult partnership between two deeply insecure outsiders. She was insecure about her appearance and her finances. He was insecure about his rank and his lack of a role. And they both tried to fill those internal voids with external things: parties, clothes, status, and glamour. They were a financial disaster waiting to happen. So was Mary Adelaide a simple-minded spendthrift? She was a complex, intelligent, and deeply feeling woman born into a system that gave her a title, but denied her all agency and the funds to support it. Her extravagance wasn't just frivolity. It was a defiant, if profoundly self-destructive, attempt to live the life she had been denied, to claim the status everyone told her she should have, but refused to support. She was a prisoner who insisted on decorating her own cell with the finest silks and diamonds, even if she had to beg, borrow, and steal to do it. After returning from exile in 1885, chastened but not broken, Mary Adelaide's sole laser-focused ambition was her daughter. May was now in her late teens, entering her 20s, and she was by all accounts a challenge. She was quiet. She was beautiful. She was intelligent. But she was, in the words of many quarters, dull. She was painfully, cripplingly shy. She had none of her mother's infectious charisma. She was, in many ways, the opposite of what the glamorous London marriage market wanted. Mary Adelaide didn't care. She had a plan. Her daughter would not be paraded around Europe, rejected by minor princes. Her daughter, the child of Fat Mary, the Exile, would aim for the single greatest prize in the world, the future King of England. The target was Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Airedale, known to his family as Eddie. Eddie was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales and Princess Alexandra, and therefore the heir presumptive to the throne after his father. He was the ultimate prize. He was also in royal circles a known quantity, and not in a good way. He was damaged goods. Eddie was not like his father, who at least had charisma. Eddie was lazy, listless, and possessed a languid, apathetic charm. He was rumored to be learning disabled, slow, and unfocused. Worse, he had been vaguely but dangerously implicated in the Cleveland Street scandal of 1889, involving a male brothel raided by police. Although modern historians have largely cleared him, at the time, the rumors were rampant. Even later, absurd rumors would link him to Jack the Ripper. He was, in his own way, a royal problem in need of a solution. Mary Adelaide saw an opportunity. She was one of the few people who genuinely liked Daddy. She saw his sweetness, his vulnerability, and she saw that her daughter May, with her quiet strength and steady, serious nature, was exactly what this flighty future king needed. She saw a solution to both problems. Her dull daughter would stabilize the unstable heir. She schemed, she cajoled, she charmed. She put May in Eddie's path at every possible country house party, at every ball. She used her own immense popularity with the Prince and Princess of Wales to push the match. Queen Victoria, too, saw the sense in it. May was steady. May was serious. May was English-born. May would be a good influence. Mary Adelaide was relentless. And in December 1891 at Luton Hoo, Prince Albert Victor proposed to Princess May of Teck. It was the ultimate vindication, the most stunning, spectacular triumph imaginable. Mary Adelaide, Fat Mary, the bankrupt exile, the family joke, the unmarriageable princess, was now officially the mother-in-law of the future King of England. She had won. She had beaten the system that had ridiculed her. She was, as she wrote in her diary, delirious with joy. And then, just 6 weeks later, the most horrific, unthinkable tragedy struck. In January 1892, Prince Eddie, who had fallen ill with influenza during the devastating global pandemic, died at Sandringham. He was 28 years old. It was a national catastrophe. The nation was plunged into mourning. But for Mary Adelaide, it was the end of everything. Her life's work, her daughter's future, her family's hard-won vindication, all of it gone, vanished in a fever. Mary Adelaide's audacious gamble had seemingly paid off, only for tragedy to strike. The death of Prince Albert Victor Eddie was not just a national catastrophe. For Mary Adelaide, it was personal annihilation. Her entire life's work, it had all collapsed. Her daughter May was now a tragic figure, the widowed fiancée of a dead heir, a piece of dynastic damaged goods. Mary Adelaide's vindication had vanished. But the old handovers are a tough, pragmatic breed, and Queen Victoria, the ultimate ruler, was even more pragmatic. She was the CEO of the monarchy, and in tragedy, she saw a logistical problem. There was another son, the spare, Prince George, Duke of York, the future George V. George was the complete antithesis of his brother. Where Eddie was lazy, flighty, and uncertain, George was steady, serious, and, in the words of many quarters, even duller than May. He was a career naval officer, a man who had spent his entire life in his brother's shadow, expecting a life of service in the Royal Navy, not on the throne. He was a man of discipline, stamp collecting, and punctuality. He hated parties, despised glamour, and was utterly terrified of the emotional chaos that Mary Adelaide represented. In an arrangement that seems bizarrely, almost brutally cold to our modern sensibilities, and was even a bit shocking. Then the royal family simply repurposed the fiancé. This was not a romantic plot. This was an act of state policy. Queen Victoria, over the previous year, had watched May carefully. She had determined that this shy, reserved young woman was exactly what the monarchy needed. May was not brilliant. She was not alarmingly clever, but she was stable. She was serious. She was beautiful. She was English-born. She was perfect queen material. Queen Victoria had invested in May, and she was not about to let such a valuable asset go to waste, just because her original fiancé had inconveniently died. Prince George also played a role. He had always admired May from afar. He saw in her the calm and strength he knew his brother lacked. During the period of mourning, as May conducted herself, not with hysterical tears, but with a quiet, stoic dignity. George's admiration turned into a deeper affection. She was an island of order in the storm.
And so the dynastic machine began to turn. A year of formal mourning passed. Gently but firmly, May, the grieving fiancée of one brother, was pushed towards the other. Under pressure from Queen Victoria and the expectation of both families, Prince George, now the new heir, proposed. May, trapped by duty, that very duty that had been forged in her as a direct rebellion against her mother, accepted. Their relationship was built on the shared foundation of Eddie's loss and a mutual, almost unromantic commitment to duty. And on July 6, 1893, at the Chapel Royal St. James's Palace, Princess May of Teck, the daughter of the bankrupt, socially outcast, unsuitable to Grand Mary Adelaide, was married to Prince George, Duke of York. She was now the Duchess of York. She was the future Queen of England, this time for real. This is Mary Adelaide's true and staggering legacy. Without her unsuitable marriage to the inferior Prince Francis of Teck, there is no Princess May. Without Princess May and her steady, serious, almost repressed character, a character forged directly in the crucible of her mother's chaos, there would be no one, Queen Victoria, deemed the perfect candidate to stabilize both her grandsons. And without that union, the entire direct line of the modern House of Windsor vanishes. There is no King George V. There is no King George V, the beloved stuttering hero of World War II. There is no Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history. There is no King Charles III. The current King of England flows directly, uninterrupted, from the blood of the woman the establishment dismissed as Fat Mary. The mother the crown tried to forget was in fact the grandmother of the crown. But Mary Adelaide's legacy is a twin legacy, a perfect psychological cause and effect. She didn't just provide the blood, she provided the antidote. The first legacy is the fortress, her daughter, Queen Mary. Queen Mary was so psychologically terrified of her mother's emotional chaos and financial ruin that she became the very icon of royal duty and restraint. Queen Mary's famous rigidity, her obsession with collecting and cataloging royal jewels, and her unbending duty-first mantra. It was all a direct psychological reaction to her childhood. Queen Mary saved the monarchy in the 20th century by making it an institution of unbreakable stability. The 20th century monarchy, in essence, was a decades-long disciplined and wildly successful attempt to not be Mary Adelaide. But there is a second legacy. It is the flame. The archetype Mary Adelaide herself created the people's princess model. The joy, the warmth, the emotional connection to the public, the glamour, the chaos, and the danger that comes with it. That archetype never really went away. It simply went underground, suppressed by the rigidity of her daughter and her granddaughter. But it was still there, smoldering, waiting to erupt again. And it did erupt spectacularly and tragically nearly a century later in her great-granddaughter-in-law Diana, Princess of Wales. Diana, like Mary Adelaide, was seen as emotional and chaotic by the institution. Like Mary Adelaide, she rejected royal stiffness to forge a direct human tactile connection with the public. And like Mary Adelaide, she became dangerously popular, winning the public's love while being seen as an unstable outsider internally. Mary Adelaide's life created two wearing templates for modern royalty: the rigid, dutiful institutional monarch, and the emotional, popular, and chaotic outsider. The entire drama of the modern royal family, the conflict between the firm and the heart, is in many ways a playing out of the war that existed within Mary Adelaide's own life.
The eternal, unresolvable tension between what is expected and what is human. Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, Duchess of Teck, did not live to see her daughter crowned queen. Mary Adelaide died in October 1897 at White Lodge, just before her 64th birthday. After a lifetime of robust, seemingly indestructible health, she never fully recovered from a routine operation and died of heart failure. She died as she had lived, surrounded by a mess of outstanding bills. But she also died adored by her family, and most importantly by the British public. Her funeral was an event of genuine, spontaneous national mourning.
The streets of London were lined not by order, but by choice, with tens of thousands of ordinary people, the poor, the sick, the orphaned from her charities, all weeping for the woman they truly saw as their princess. Her life was a profound, painful, and beautiful contradiction. She was a royal highness who had to hide from creditors. She was a figure of public ridicule who was simultaneously an object of intense public love. She was the mother whose chaotic life created the most rigid, beautiful queen in British history. The very woman who would save the monarchy from itself. The crown for a century did its best to forget her, to remember the austere, diamond-clad Queen Mary, and to quietly edit out the awkward, uncomfortable, and deeply human story of her loud, bankrupt, and joyous mother. But history has a way of remembering the truth. Mary Adelaide was a woman who was told her entire life that she was too much. She was too large for the era's fashions. She was too emotional for the era's sensibilities. She was too extravagant for her bank account. And her entire life was a glorious, defiant, and deeply flawed refusal to shrink. She once famously roared with laughter at a suggestion that her plans were too ambitious, declaring, "My dear, I am too grand." She meant it as a joke, but it was the profound central truth of her existence. In a world that constantly tried to make her small, she chose always to be too grand. And in doing so, in refusing to be erased, this forgotten princess secured a dynasty, created a new model for public service, and left a legacy of joy, kindness, and flawed, defiant humanity that the crown could never, ever truly forget.